Hello bookworms, it's Jade from Bedtime Bookworm and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here to talk about my top 5 favorite books that I read during the winter. If this is the first time you're seeing one of my seasonal wrap-ups, let me give you a quick overview of what this video is about. Basically, every season I like to look back on the things that I read during that season and I figure out what were my favorites. I actually rank them against each other to come up with my top 5 books. I will tell you all of the books I read in the order that I enjoyed them, and then for my top 5 books, I'll go into a lot more depth about why I like them so much. I'll have my monthly wrap-ups for the 3 months, which in this case is going to be December 2019, and then January and February of 2020. I know that's kind of weird to have 1 month from last year, but I actually kind of like it that way, being a little offset from the calendar year. But I'll have those monthly wrap-ups down in the description box, and if you guys are interested in more thoughts on these books, especially the ones that I don't go in depth on, then you can find more thoughts in those wrap-ups. Okay, so in the winter, I read or picked up a total of 13 books. One of these books was one that I chose to DNF or did not finish. This is how my ratings shook out. I only had 1 2-star book, which was the book that I DNF'd. I had 3 3-stars, 6 4-stars, and 3 5-stars. I'm really happy with this distribution of ratings. I'm always shooting for the majority of the books I read to be 4 stars, so this makes me really happy. I didn't have any rereads in the winter. I'm just not really a big rereader, so they don't come up that often for me, but even less so now that I'm not reading The Wheel of Time or the Farseer trilogy. Okay, let's get started. My 2-star read of the winter was Little Darlings by Melanie Golding, and again, this is the one that I DNF'd. The 3-star book that is at the bottom of the 3 stars for me is Whiteout by Ken Follett, followed by The Last Dragon Princess by Cynthia Payne, which is a book I received for free in exchange for an honest review. And the top of my 3 stars is The Enchanted by Renee Denfeld. And then going into my 4-star books, I did have to pick 2 out of the 6 4-stars I read to include in my top 5. That was not an easy choice because I had a lot of awesome 4-star reads in the winter, but coming in at the bottom of my 4 stars is The Broken Eye by Brent Weeks. This is the 3rd book in the Lightbringer series, followed by Before They Are Hanged by Joe Abercrombie, which is the 2nd book in the First Law trilogy, followed by Becoming by Michelle Obama, and then followed by Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo, which is the 1st book in the Ninth House series, some series. All right, that brings me to my top 5. Like I said, there are 2 4-star books in this top 5. At the bottom of the top 5 list, I have Caliban's War by James S.A. Corey. This is an adult sci-fi book. It is the 2nd book in the Expanse series, and I was so excited to read this because I really enjoyed the 1st book, Leviathan Wakes, which I read in the fall. This book did not disappoint. It picks up a little while after the 1st book. At this point, I don't remember how long. I want to say like 6 months, but I don't really remember. And there are quite a few characters that we followed in the 1st book, so it was great to catch up with them and see what they were doing. But we were also introduced to 2 new characters, 2 female characters that are like really sassy, strong, badass female characters that I absolutely loved, and they were definitely the highlight of this book for me. The political intrigue in this world is amped up in this book, and it was really interesting to see how things played out after the way things ended in the last book. We're definitely dealing with the consequences of things that happened in the 1st book. I found this book to be engaging and interesting, and it made me laugh multiple times because some of the interactions between the characters are just hilarious and so funny. The ending of this book, the last sentence, had me dropping my jaw. I was in shock at how things ended at the very end, and I am dying to read the next book now. I need to know what happened, like what is the explanation for the thing that happened at the end of this book. If you've read it, you know. But anyways, this book did not have 2nd book syndrome. I enjoyed it a lot. Not quite perfect, not quite a 5-star read. The 1st book, Leviathan Wakes, was also like not quite a 5-star read, but a very high 4. So I'm very excited about continuing on in this series, and I hope it stays as good as the first 2 books have been. And for those of you wondering, I have not yet continued on in the show. I've only watched like 3 episodes a while ago. Alright, coming in at number 4, the other 4-star book that made it into my top 5 is Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is another adult sci-fi book, but it is very different from Caliban's War, and honestly very different from anything that I've read before. I fully recognize that this book won't appeal to everybody. In fact, I was doing this one as a buddy read, and half of our buddy read decided to DNF the book. But let me tell you what I liked about this book and why I loved it so much. So at the beginning of this book, humans are trying to create intelligent life on another planet that they have terraformed, and apparently this is like an experiment that has been happening on multiple planets. They're trying to terraform them to create other places for humans to live because we are destroying the planet. But things go very wrong at the beginning of the book, and while the intention was to create intelligent apes, instead intelligent spiders are created. So you follow 2 parallel storylines. One is following humans, and the other is following these intelligent spiders. And the time span for this book is like thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So that's something that's a little hard to wrap your head around, and honestly makes the book different because you're following these species for such a long amount of time. You're not following the same characters necessarily through the whole time period. And I think for someone who is really character driven, that would definitely be a downfall for this book, because while the characters you are introduced to are interesting, the main characters change a few times, and you just don't really get a close connection with the characters. As we're going through this long timeline, you're seeing the evolution of the spiders, and yes, you get a point of view from these intelligent spiders, which I wasn't aware was going to happen, but was actually one of my favorite parts, or probably my favorite part, was seeing the story through the spiders' eyes. They were just so interesting, and I'm actually someone who's fairly arachnophobic, and I was kind of nervous about that, but the way the spiders are described, and because you're seeing from their point of view, they're a little bit humanized, but also you're very aware of what makes them different. Anyways, what I found fascinating about this book was the science and the philosophy that was explored. So it's much more of a like exploring interesting ideas kind of science fiction book, in my opinion, rather than like an action-packed adventure. And I think knowing that will help people to figure out if it's something that they're interested in reading. Like I said, my favorite part were the spiders, which definitely surprised me and not what I was expecting. Some of the interesting ideas explored were like, what would intelligence look like in a species that is very different from us and has very different senses than we do? How would an intelligent species like that develop religion and its own kind of science? And how do they interact with their creators, especially when we speak very different languages, but also like not just trying to figure out how to communicate with a completely different species, but the idea that language changes over thousands and thousands of years. So how would we, as future humans, communicate or even be able to read the records of humans from thousands and thousands of years ago? It was just fascinating, and my little scientist heart loved it so much. But again, I recognize that some people are just gonna think this is like not interesting or weird. Okay, moving on to my 3 5-star reads. At the bottom of my 5 stars, I have The Queens of Innis Lear by Tessa Gratton. This is an adult high fantasy that is a retelling of Shakespeare's King Lear, which is not a play that I was very familiar with. So I went into it not knowing anything about the original story, which for me worked out really well. I hate when you go into a retelling and you're really familiar with the source material, and then the whole time you're just like comparing the two as you read it. So I was able to enjoy this book without constantly thinking about the source material. I did know going into this that it would be a tragedy, but I was not expecting such an emotional reaction from myself by the end of the book. I don't know why. I mean, I cry really easily in books, but this was a book that really snuck up on me. Like, I was enjoying it while I was reading it, and I thought the characters were interesting, and then all of a sudden, I had all of these emotions towards these characters that I didn't realize that I had until I had them. I think this is a really interesting story about sisters who want very different things. All of the characters in this book were so complex, and their relationships with each other were really complex, which was my favorite thing. A lot of the characters are morally gray, and you can empathize with them for certain things, while also at the same time they would do things that I absolutely detested. And I just think it's so awesome when an author can evoke such conflicting emotions from you about a single character. I also love the world and the magic. So the main country in this world is Innis, Lear, and it's an island. And on this island, the trees and the wind can talk to each other. It's a very nature-y magic. I haven't read anything quite like it before, and I just really loved it. And I hope that she continues to write stories in this world. I know that her newest book, Lady Hotspur, is set in this world, and I'm super excited about that, but I would love for her to keep writing books set in this world, even if they continue to be different Shakespeare retellings. I think that's really cool. I would love to see Tessa Gratton do a Romeo and Juliet retelling, just because she's so good at writing tragic love stories, I feel like. My second to favorite book that I read in the winter was Bright We Burn by Kiersten White. This is the third and final book in the Conqueror saga, which is a series that is a gender-bent version of Vlad the Impaler. So I would consider this to be historical fantasy. I did just talk about this book in my genre bender video, but basically it reads very much like a historical fiction. It's set in our world. It takes into account actual things that happened in our history. It's about the Ottoman Empire, which is not something that I knew very much about, but it does have a fantasy-ish element because Vlad the Impaler is a woman named Lada. My favorite thing about this series, which continue to be true in this last installment of the series, are the characters. Again, you have really complex characters with complex relationships that are just really well fleshed out, and I definitely think that is the highlight of the series. I also found the history stuff to be really interesting because, like I said, it's a time period in an area of the world that I don't know that much about. I had definitely hyped myself up for a very emotional and heartbreaking ending to the trilogy, and I'm happy to say that I wasn't quite as emotionally broken at the end as what I thought I might be, but that is not me complaining. I am happy I didn't cry as much as I thought I might, but I did still cry. It was still emotional, but honestly, this is one of the best endings to a trilogy I've ever read. I felt like things were wrapped up in a good way, and everybody got closure, and just the ending was really fitting for these characters, and I loved it. I loved it so much. All right, now on to my favorite book that I read in the past 3 months. It's actually one that I read in December, so towards the beginning of the season, although I guess I did read it around Christmas, so whatever. But that is Nosferatu by Joe Hill. This is an adult horror book, which I also talked about in my genre bender video because it's a horror fantasy. There's definitely a fantastical element to this book. Now, I've heard a lot about Joe Hill, I've heard a lot about Nosferatu, but I honestly wasn't expecting to love it as much as I did going in, just because Joe Hill is famous for being Stephen King's son, and I wasn't sure how much of the hype is because of that and how much of it is real, I guess. However, I should have known better. This is one of my really good friend's favorite books. It's Rachel from the Shades of Orange's, and we actually did it as a buddy read. It was a reread for her, obviously, but a first-time read for me, and that was a lot of fun. She highly encouraged me to listen to the audiobook, and I didn't start listening to the audiobook until about 15 or 20% in, and I'm totally kicking myself because I really should have started from the beginning. The narrator for this book is Kate Mulgrew, who is an actress. As many of you guys have mentioned, she is Captain Jane from Star Trek. Hopefully I'm getting that right. But she was phenomenal. She definitely does creepy voices really well. Her voice acting is just amazing and really brought this book to life and these characters to life. Not only was the story interesting and engaging, but I quickly fell in love with the characters in this book, which is often something that I'm missing when I'm reading horror. I feel like a lot of times in horror, you're more focused on what's going on and not necessarily on creating fully fleshed out and interesting characters. But I love the characters in this book, especially the main central family. I actually cried over the romance in this book, which doesn't necessarily mean much because, like I said, I do cry easily, but I really liked the characters and their relationships in this book. And I just loved it. Another thing that I really liked that Joe Hill did in this book is that he is not scared to let his characters get hurt. You know what? There's so many times where a character does something or something happens to them in a book and they walk away barely scuffed up. That does not happen in this book. There were so many times where the main characters got hurt that I was just like, oh my god. But it seems so realistic because if those things happened to me, I would be broken too because I'm not a superhuman. So I really appreciated that about this book. After reading this book, I am so excited to read more Joe Hill. He has a few books out there that I'm really interested in and some short story collections too, but I definitely need to try more of his stuff because I am hooked after reading Nosferatu. Alright guys, those are my thoughts on my 5 favorite books that I read during the months of the winter. If you have read any of these books, let me know what you thought of them down in the comment section, or let me know what some of your favorite books from the winter were. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more bookish content. That is all I have for now. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bookworms, keep reading. Bye.